Okay, call this public hearing to order. Topic is comprehensive plan and zone amendment at 164, 170, 180 South First Street. And I will now turn it over to our city planner, Jacob Greichen.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
This is the legislative land use hearing. The subject of the hearing are amendments to the comprehensive plan and the zoning map to change from general commercial to apartment residential, and accompanying comprehensive plan amendment. Because legislative proceedings require the observance of certain formalities, the council must take a few moments to cover some preliminary matters and required statements. Does any member of the council wish to declare a conflict of interest or bias in this matter? I see none. Fantastic. Does anyone in the audience want to object to the ability of a councilor to make a fair decision? Don't see any takers on that. So the rules for the conduct of the hearing are set forth in the handout on the table in the back of the room. Generally, the order of the proceedings will be as follows. Required statements, which I'm doing right now, staff report, applicant's presentation, and then public testimony in favor, neutral, and opposed. Any rebuttal by the applicant if they show up. Close of the hearing, close of the record, deliberations, and decision. Following statements are to be made at the commencement of the hearing. Standards for the decision of the council are based on St. Helens Municipal Code 17.20.120, Section 1, standards for a legislative decision. All testimony, arguments, and evidence must be directed towards the applicable standards listed or other criteria which the person applies to the decision. So with that stuff out of the way, let's talk about what we're doing here. So we're close to where we're at now, so I'm sure you all are familiar with this property as you've driven by it many times. And it's the property with the lavender-colored building that's really close to the sidewalk. If you've been in town a long time, it was a hair stylist place many, many years ago. So it's that property and the one to the south of it, as you can see on the map there. Those properties have been zoned general commercial since the city's modern zoning in the late 70s. And they're requesting a change to go from that to apartment residential. And what kind of prompted this particular application was one of the properties came up for sale. And when that happens, you know, we talk to lenders and such. And the classic question that we get is, you know, if this home is destroyed, can we rebuild it? And in the general commercial zone, single-family dwellings are not an allowed use by themselves. And so the answer from us would be, well, if it's destroyed by more than 60% of its value, it's gone for good. And so, and we've seen zone changes like this before where they're trying to alleviate that problem. Of course, our goal is the public good, and so we have to look at our policies for that. Like I said, they're both developed with a detached single-family dwelling. So, a few things we can look at in considering this is our housing needs analysis and our economic opportunities analysis. The former document, which we've just gone through, that looks at our residential supply and where we're at with that in the next 20 years. And what that says is we need to give a little more attention to, our high-density residential lands, which would be our apartment residential zoning. And Kathy, if you could go to the next map, the next one. Okay, so this is our zoning map. You can see the subject property is there in red. There's a kind of a hash mark within. And you have that brownish color. That's apartment residential zoning. That's our highest residential zoning district. And so they're looking at basically moving that boundary to be more or less flush with the commercial boundary on the other side of First Street by the old Ice House building there. So, given our housing needs, it would expand our apartment residential zoning, which our housing needs analysis says is good. If this abutted R7 or R10, it'd be a little more challenging to say that it advances that. So that's the housing needs. This is commercial land, though, so we have to consider our employment lands, our commercial industrial lands. And that's where our economic opportunities analysis comes in. That's an older document. It was adopted in 2009. And so it's starting to accumulate some cobwebs. Still has some use, though. It noted a shortage of commercial lands of about 10 acres back then. And since then, we've rezoned the veneer site, which is 23.5, to mixed use, which I'm sure accommodates it. But the essence of that is we don't have a lot of extra commercial land, and so we need to be careful about losing it. We need to, our commercial lands need to be looked at as precious in some degree. And so that's kind of the counter argument that we as staff, okay, are we shooting ourselves in the foot, to use the term used earlier in the work session, in regards to our employment lands? And the fact that we have rezoned things to make up that surplus, that helps. But we still want to be cautious about it. And I should note that the staff does recommend approval of this, and the Planning Commission had a unanimous recommendation, and we'll get into those reasons right now. So one simple thing is zoning pattern. Zoning determines use, determines compatibility, and so it's nice when the patterns aren't too funky. And so evening that out there, that helps. That's always good. First Street is a collector street. And although we have a wide right-of-way there, as you know, it's one of those streets in town that is terraced. There's two parts of it. And so the street takes up a lot more room than if it was just a flat plane. And our development code talks about when we have development that we want to have a design that does not require backing movements into collector streets. And there's not a whole lot of room there. And then our comprehensive plan talks about having good vehicular access and sufficient parking. And these are small lots, and individually they're a little challenging. They would be challenging to accommodate any substantial commercial use. And so that's one thing to look at, the unique circumstances of the street and the size. And then on the other side, River Street, you just have the drop-off there. Another thing to consider is, of course, the non-conforming use status. And then the question there is, okay, is there something that we want to preserve that has a public good? And that's always the important thing to think about, private versus public good. One of these houses, 180 South First one, and that's the southerly most lot of the two we're talking about. Now, I had mentioned that this zoning has been like this since the late 70s. In the early 80s, the city undertook an effort to create a downtown historic district. One of these properties is within that, and it's considered to be contributing, or it matters to the district. It's not alien in its architecture. We also have a comprehensive policy that says, we want to do stuff with historic resources that are threatened with demolition. If we have policies that say, okay, well, you can't rebuild the house and it's a historic resource, and someone doesn't want to put the money into, turn it into, retail or something, because building codes trigger other things. You could have laws that result in someone not wanting to give that historic resource any love and care, and then it just rots. And so that's another argument why going to residential helps meet our standards, our policies. So basically you have this, are we shooting ourselves in the foot from an employment land standpoint because it's small, because it's challenging from a parking and access standpoint? No, it's apartment residential, which is great from our housing needs standpoint. It helps protect the historic resource. evens up that line, and that's why you're having recommendation from the Planning Commission staff. Also, given the absence of audience, it's not a controversial issue either. And I wish they were all that easy.
Let's find out if it's
But
controversial.
let's find out. So any questions for me before we open it up for comment?
Yeah, did the commission impose any conditions?
No. No, they approved it as proposed.
And I would like to become more familiar with the northerlymost lot and with the structure that is adjacent or almost connected to the sidewalk. And that would be the hair salon of past. No conditions on that.
No, and it's because it's a zone change. We would consider that a grandfathered accessory structure. Now, the people who purchased it have talked about tearing it down. Of course, we don't necessarily have any ability to force it. But that's an interesting structure. Jenny looked into it, and I guess it was moved there in the 1930s.
Wow.
It doesn't look like a 30s era building.
Probably was a garage at that time.
Could have been.
If you look at the structure, it looks like it's older than that.
Oh, okay.
So my question is more pointed to, okay, so it's a zone change. So you're grandfathering something in from a commercial zone into a residential zone. You're changing the zone. And don't you have to, in a sense, upgrade to the existing zone and follow those guidelines? Now, I've heard things like this before in the Portland area, and when they change zones, when they change zones, then they accepted the current zoning conditions, and current zoning, that would be illegal.
What I hear him saying, Council President, is that we'd be going to a tan instead of a red. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the abutting properties, in looking at that, would almost line up perfectly across the street as well, with a red and a red almost equal, if we chose to vote in favor of. But that's on the deliberation and a vote later.
Yeah, I think Council President Morton's concern is the history of use and how that translates to this proposal. And, for one, this modern zoning goes back to 78, and that building and the house predated modern zoning. The other thing to think about is, so we know it was a hair salon long ago, but I know driving by it for 13 years, including my time with the county, it hasn't been used for a hair salon in that amount of time. And so if we talk about our non-conforming use rules, there's, the destruction factor. Okay, it's destroyed by a certain amount, it goes away. There's also a discontinuance of use factor, which is 6 months or a year, depending on the circumstances. In this case, it's been well over a decade. And so if you wanted to establish a new commercial use, all the current rules would apply. And they would be tough to meet because it's so confined, meeting your parking, demonstrating that the parking, in addition to the existing residential uses that are there, isn't going to result in backing movements into the street, would be hugely challenging. And so when I talk about it being grandfathered, it would be grandfathered as a structure, but as an accessory structure, like a shed or something, to the dwelling, not a commercial enterprise.
Yeah, that wasn't my concern. My concern was, since it's a residential, since it goes, if we go to residential and it goes to the TAN, is not that in a residential zone, is not that an illegal building put right up against the sidewalk?
It would be grandfathered.
I don't care about grandfathered. I care about it not being grandfathered. And so why would it be grandfathered? Because you're changing from one zone. If this passes, you're changing from one zone to another zone. Why? You know, if it was heavy industrial and you changed it to commercial, you're saying that whatever was going on in heavy industrial could be applied to commercial. That's wrong. And I'm saying that since it's commercial, it's going to residential. And if that's an illegal structure in a residence, that like a new residence, and this is a new zone, then why would you grandfather it in? I don't get it.
Only thing I could think of is that there was a lot of that back in the day, and that we have adopted over the years and tolerated a lot of the old structures, and it's existing. I mean, I kind of get that. Same property owner for both properties, or all three addresses?
Two different property owners.
Okay.
It becomes a matter of what aspect of non-conforming use do you want to pick on. So that building, you're correct. It doesn't meet the front setback. But this is a double frontage lot. It abuts two streets. You have River Street on one side, First Street on the other side. So if you say, okay, a condition of the zone change is to remove what we're calling an accessory structure, then what about the 20-foot setback on River Street? It abuts there. So would you make them remove the portion of the house on that side as well? So those are some of the questions that kind of come up. And usually the way we look at it, and I'm not saying you can't impose a condition to remove the shed. It's just you have your existing circumstances, and when you change the zone, the rules under those circumstances change. So under commercial, yeah, you could probably, if that old hair salon building burned, you could probably rebuild it. You change it to residential, it goes away, you couldn't rebuild it. Now, if you feel that that should be a condition, we can certainly add that to it, and it probably wouldn't be, one with a fight.
Well, especially if the owners were considering removing it and tearing it down.
Yeah, they had talked about that.
Okay, you've answered my question.
Okay. Any other questions?
I didn't know if you said this in the staff report. What I understood from what they presented to the Planning Commission, it was about the lender and the title report, trying to make it all clean, kind of like what we've done up in Holton, where we have the vast expanse of commercial, and then homeowners can't sell their house because it's residential in a commercial zone.
Yeah, that's what's prompting it. And given the fact that it's been zoned like this since 78, and I don't know how far our current non-conforming policies go back, but they go back at least to the 90s, maybe 80s. It's surprising that this is coming up now and hasn't come up before, and maybe lenders are just being more aggressive. But you're correct. What prompted this is a sale. There's a transfer of ownership.
Had the same owner for all these years.
Yeah, so maybe that was why nothing happened, and so
Right, and the house with the little building is the one that is the catalyst.
That is.
The other ones are next door, and when they went next door to say, well, did you know this? Did you know this? No, I didn't know that. And it's like, let's do it together kind of thing.
You're right.
So it's like trying to make it make sense as opposed to piecemeal one lot at a time.
And in the discussion we had, Linda Bullen, local realtor, was kind of the person who helped move the application. We talked about, if you got this other lot, it would help even up that line and make it kind of a cleaner change. The condos to the south of that are considered multi-dwelling units, which are possible in the general commercial zone. And so, that's not a rebuild hazard, lending hazard like the other two. Any other questions before we see if there's any public testimony?
A matter of process, how would we go about, or how would the council go about recommending that what I consider, and many people consider, have talked to me about it, an eyesore, which is that structure that's on First Street and next to the sidewalk. How would we go about as a condition, implying a condition that with this zone change, and we accept on First Street the residential, the existing residential code, and that building must be removed?
We would, what we would have to do is incorporate into the ordinance and say that the zone change takes effect once that building is removed. And if it's not removed within a year, then the decision becomes null and void.
Okay.
Probably be the best way to go about it.
Yeah, and I think with the council, and I don't know how many people individuals on the council feel like I do, that it is a detriment to First Street and it is an eyesore. In some senses, it's a matter of safety. I see kids kind of pounding on it every now and then, and a few other kinds of concerns that I've always had with that building, ever since it's been neglected. And it's been neglected for a long, long time.
It certainly has.
So that's my underlying concern, rather than the ethics of looking at the existing residential, the existing residential zone change. And I hope I'm clear on that.
Yeah, and I don't mean to butt in, but this is kind of our deliberations that we're doing right now, and
This is hearings.
but it's questions. We're doing deliberations. Deliberations are later, so that would be the time to discuss the.
Yeah, I wanted clarification
Yep.
from,
Yep.
and I'm not asking to discuss
The-
it.
the-
I just
the-
wanted
the-
clarification.
We have to stick
from-
to the agenda, which is the amendment. If it's questions on that, it's not about amending an amendment with resolutions and stuff. It's about the proposed application, right, Jacob?
Yeah, it's not a bad thing to have on the table because that could
No, but that should
that
really
could
happen.
prompt.
That should really happen in deliberations, though.
Not necessarily. I mean, either place is fine.
Okay.
It's always a gray area, but it's probably a good time to move on to
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
public.
Jacob, what is the definition of eyesore?
That's a good question,
It
Steve.
hurts.
Because, well, if that's the case, I have a brand new building on 4th Street that's an eyesore. That gets us into sticky waters, what I'm worried about.
We can talk about this in deliberation.
Yeah, I know.
Yep, and we
But
will.
as I say,
And we
that's
will.
what I wanted, a definition, if it is a legal definition of eyesore.
And I can change my opinion on that.
Sure. Yeah, this
Maybe I
is-
don't see it as an eyesore, and maybe I see it as a safety detriment.
Sure.
Anyways, next.
So we good on the questions before? Okay. Does anybody would like to speak in favor of this proposal? Is anybody even here to talk about this proposal? You're
My name is Rich Mason. I guess my question is this that old building that used to be a beauty salon?
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought you were talking about, yeah. Yeah, that thing's terrible. It needs to come down. Okay? Okay.
Thank you.
anything else?
Anybody want to talk about this? No takers. Okay. So that means we don't need to do any rebuttal. City attorney does not matter. Any last questions of staff before we close the public hearing? Doesn't look like it.
Okay, this public hearing is closed.